Together with my colleagues, we decided to produce a series of programs focused on strategy development and implementation.
Strategy is always about the market, always about how we position ourselves in that market. And a market is never just our company, it is always a circle of competitors.
Even a successful business without a strategy can end up trapped, where we keep running but stay in the same place.
The approach to strategy should be regular, just like the approach to sports equipment.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. We all know that boards of directors, supervisory boards, and by the way, other boards operate at the strategic level. And of course, both strategy development and implementation are associated with many successful cases, as well as some that are far less successful. That is why my colleagues and I decided to produce a series of programs focused on strategy development and implementation. Today, our guests are Dmytro Kozlov and Armen Kurginian. Welcome, colleagues.
Hello, Sergey.
My colleagues and I serve on the boards of directors of Ukrainian companies, and of course we deal with strategy issues on a regular basis. We encounter situations where we are developing strategy for companies where we serve on the board of directors or for companies we help through our consulting work. There is probably no point in asking whether a business needs a strategy or not. Of course, a strategy does not provide a 100% guarantee of achieving a strategic goal. On the other hand, strategy increases the likelihood of achieving it. Lately, business owners have been approaching us quite often because they feel their businesses are beginning to stagnate. Of course, this may be related to the current wartime situation in our country and its impact on every market in which businesses operate. On the other hand, it may also be caused by the lack of a strategy or by an inadequate one. In other words, the strategy needs to change. Something has to be done at the strategic level. In your opinion, how often do companies really need to work at the strategic level in situations like these?
In my view, strategy should be reviewed regularly even without these circumstances. In other words, even if there is no sense that the company is stagnating, the approach to strategy should be regular, just like the approach we take to sports equipment, so to speak. Especially if there is a feeling that what we planned, the way we envisioned the future, is no longer working. That is why I believe that reviewing and updating the strategy is always justified.
I agree with Armen. If a business has no strategy, it becomes more of a reaction to external or internal challenges. And even a successful business without a strategy can end up in a situation where we keep running but stay in the same place. Absolutely.
There is also a common misconception among owners and top managers that holding a few strategy sessions is enough to develop a strategy as a comprehensive vision of where the company is heading. In my view, this is essentially a confusion between strategic planning and the strategy session. Yes, a strategy session can certainly be part of the strategic planning process, but it is not enough to develop a comprehensive strategy.
Right, because as a result of a strategy session, whether conducted internally or with consultants, you can produce an interesting document and put it on a shelf where it will gather dust and remain there for 10, 15, 3 or 2 years.
Yes, and one reason for that may be that the key employees who should have been responsible for implementing parts of the strategy were not involved in the strategic planning process.
The depth of employee involvement in the strategic planning process is a critical issue here, because expertise varies across different levels. And in order to have a balanced perspective, both from experts and from senior management, you need to involve key employees at all levels, from the bottom up.
In my view, strategy cannot be based solely on internal expertise. We can certainly think about whom to involve from within the company, but external expertise is also essential. Why? Because strategy is always about the market, always about how we position ourselves in that market. And the market is never just our company, it includes a broader circle of competitors. And this is where the role of the board is hard to overestimate, because it is precisely this broader perspective, the wider view of how the rest of the market behaves, what others expect, and how adjacent markets to ours are evolving. All of this is what the board can bring to the strategic planning process through its experience, the network of its members, and the collective expertise it has accumulated.
Sure, yes. There's a traditional approach, and perhaps it is already outdated, where the owner defines the strategic objectives. The board then communicates those objectives together with certain assumptions to top management. Top management develops the strategy and then returns to the board for approval. The board approves it and then oversees its implementation. And at the end of the period, it reports back to the owner on what has been achieved. But we know that for some reason this approach simply does not work. First, the owner is not always able to define the strategic objectives, and we encounter this quite often. Top management is also not always able to develop a strategy on its own and bring it back to the board for approval. In your opinion, how can this problem be addressed?
I believe that in such cases, the board's role is, if you'll pardon the tautology, truly a strategic one. It plays a strategic role in developing the strategy and supporting its development. The board not only helps develop the strategy and oversee its execution, but also helps the owner define the strategic objectives the company should pursue.
Let me briefly add something that may be explored in more detail later. The board's role is not limited to helping the owner define strategic objectives. It also oversees the strategy throughout every stage of its implementation. Formulating goals is only the beginning.
Yes, in other words, that traditional academic approach in its standard form no longer works, and that is probably due to the speed of change in the market, in society and beyond. Of course, it is also influenced by the wartime situation we are currently living through, and this requires greater involvement from the board in helping the owner refine and define the strategic objectives. Exactly, and in helping top management develop the strategy. Of course, the board is less constrained by the biases and limitations that may exist at the strategic level. On the other hand, top management and the owner are likely to have blind spots where they fail to see certain opportunities or threats, and the board can see that. In your view, what kinds of blind spots might these be?
For example, if a company operates in a particular industry with a specific product portfolio, it is most likely focused on sales, service, and the production of those particular products. And it may fail to take into account competitors that produce or sell something different, but are planning to enter the market with the same products. That is the broader picture they may fail to see because they are focused on what they are doing today.
Board members may have a different perspective on the constraints that, although I do not like the phrase, have historically developed within a company and limit, if you'll excuse the repetition, top management and the owner from taking certain actions, making certain moves, or pursuing strategic opportunities in adjacent markets, or new geographies, or certain transformations in the direction the market is moving. In other words, addressing constraints at both the individual and the organizational level. That is an important broader perspective the board can provide.
From time to time, we both join new companies. We are invited to serve on their boards of directors, or we help establish boards for other companies. In your opinion, how can you tell whether a company actually has a strategy or not? For example, we ask the CEO or the owner whether they have a strategy, and they say, yes, here it is, look, there's a book on the shelf. That's our strategy. Or are there other criteria that allow us to conclude whether a company truly has a strategy or not?
I would say that this is reflected in whether the operational decisions made by top management and the owner are aligned with a certain direction. Even if that direction, as we said previously, is not formally documented or sitting on a shelf, as we discussed, people still refer to it and rely on it when making decisions. It may be broad, such as, we wanted to enter that market, but what we're doing now isn't bringing us any closer to that goal. Or it may be quite specific. In other words, even when making day-to-day decisions, if our strategy is focused on optimization, then buying a new Cadillac, so to speak, would be challenged. And that challenge itself is a reference back to the strategy or the direction we agreed on. So even in day-to-day operations, you can tell whether there are people or functions keeping the company moving in a consistent direction, and that direction is the strategy that was chosen.
We all understand that strategic planning is a process. It is not just about developing a strategy, even if we have one, know our goals and understand what we are doing. It is also about executing what we have planned, monitoring that execution, and reviewing the strategy because external factors change. In some cases, especially during a crisis, it may make sense to review it quarterly, every 6 months or annually. It depends. And there must be an ongoing process of monitoring what we have accomplished, whether we are moving toward the goals we set, whether we are watching the external environment, competitors, suppliers, and everything else that is changing, and whether we need to revise the strategy. If all of that is in place, then you have a perfect working strategy. If it is not, then you simply have a presentation sitting on a shelf.
Let me give you a practical example. If a company's strategy, whether formally articulated or not, is based on focusing on its core business and optimizing the processes directly related to its core activities, then any other initiatives or projects should be analyzed very carefully and critically, and they will most likely be rejected. We stay focused on what matters, but people often forget this, and managers or owners frequently come forward with new ideas. Let's invest more money over here, let's acquire this asset or that one. The understanding that we are staying within our chosen direction comes when someone, even the owner, gets their hand slapped. and says, hold on, we agreed on this. We first need to subject our existing projects to a stop-loss analysis to determine which ones are still costing us money today. And yet you still want to launch new projects, so someone has to set those boundaries and cut things off. And that is what it means to stay true to the strategy, even if it is not formally documented.
I would also like to add that in some cases, even having a strategy may not lead to the desired outcome. Well, and there are two classic examples. The first is Nokia, which had a clearly defined strategy focused on hardware and its own operating system, but for some reason they failed to pay attention to external factors. They didn't adapt quickly enough to the fact that Apple entered the market with a completely new interface and an entirely different way of interacting with a phone, and it is important to understand that Nokia was practically pushed out of the market. They are making something of a comeback now, but a strategy has to adapt to external factors. Another example is Kodak, which actually could be a pioneer of digital photography back in the 1980s. Yet its entire strategy was built around protecting its film business. And we all know the outcome. They went bankrupt in 2012, if I am not mistaken. The key point here is that strategy should not be built around the past, but around what we want to achieve in the future.
We could also add BlackBerry as another example in terms of the devices they offered. They were the market leader and the first company to offer devices for corporate use. I believe they did have a strategy, but it was probably not a very good one because we all know how it ended. As Taras Kirichenko says, there is nothing worse than excellent execution of a bad strategy.
Yes, I completely agree with that.
Absolutely. But if we look at the examples you mentioned, I do not know all the details, but it seems they simply failed to take the external environment into account. While Nokia was busy thinking about its next conventional phone and paid little attention to what was happening across the ocean, the outcome was inevitable. The same applies to Kodak. They were essentially isolated inside their own bubble. They had strategies, they were market leaders then and expected to remain so for another 10 or 15 years, while outside their bubble something was happening that rendered the entire strategy obsolete.
And this is where the methodology of strategic planning comes into play.
100%.
Some methodologies focus only internally on the opportunities available to the company. Others focus on the external environment, while some combine both perspectives. Thanks to the research of Henry Mintzberg, we know that there are 10 different schools of strategic planning, each with its own distinct approach. Of course, in reality, there are probably even more of them, especially the newer approaches to strategic planning that have emerged recently. There are many different frameworks, tools, and techniques used for strategic planning. And of course, in the upcoming episodes, we will take a much closer look at these approaches, frameworks, techniques, and tools individually. We will focus on each of them in turn. Of course, each approach can be usefully applied in a particular situation, and it can be successful, and the company, by using this approach, will continue to develop further. On the other hand, choosing the wrong strategic planning methodology may lead to a very different outcome, to an ineffective strategy, loss of market position, and slower business growth. That is exactly why throughout this series on strategy, we will present a broad range of approaches. You will see different methodologies that can be applied, along with commentary on the situations where each one is most appropriate. Colleagues, in your opinion, what should determine the choice of a specific strategic planning methodology? We all know and use different methodologies in our work, but what criteria do you rely on when choosing one over another?
Well, I would put it this way, the choice of methodology depends on the type of business. It also depends on the company's stage of development, its management and leadership style, because some strategic planning methodologies are built around internal capabilities. Which market it operates in, how turbulent it is, what external influences exist. All of these factors should be assessed first. You need to look at all of this and then see which methodology is the most suitable for this particular business at this particular time, in that particular market. Exactly, in that particular market, and so on.
Is it an algorithm or is it an art? The choice of a strategic planning methodology.
It's not an algorithm, it's the expertise of the person who comes in and helps with strategizing. That is how I would put it. It is very important for the board to include people who have experience in strategic planning and who understand or at least know how to apply several different methodologies. Because if it were purely an art, you could simply invite one artist and they would suggest whatever they personally believed was best. But in reality, you need expertise that takes into account everything we have discussed, and that is exactly what the board does. It says, all right, this is the approach we recommend, and here is why.
As Henry Mintzberg actually points out, no single strategic planning methodology is suitable for every company. Companies of the same size. In fact, let me add something to the parameters you mentioned, which I completely agree with. Company size itself also influences which strategic planning approach is appropriate. So, depending on all of these factors, one approach may be more effective than another. The planning horizon may be longer or shorter and so on.
And part of the strategic planning process is an ongoing dialogue between the owner and the board, for example, or between the owner, the board, and top management. Will top management take responsibility for implementing the strategy or not? Will the board take responsibility for helping deliver results through the implementation of that strategy or not? That is genuinely very important. It is connected not only with providing guidance, developing the strategy, and overseeing its execution, but also with accepting responsibility.
I would also add that the board plays a very important role as a facilitator. We keep saying that all levels should be involved in strategic planning, but we understand that the CEO and everyone working here are dependent. The board is in a much stronger position to build a bridge between the owner's ambitions and objectives and what the company can realistically and should actually do. Board members are more independent, especially the independent directors. As a result, the process is far more objective and effective than if the CEO were to develop the strategy alone. In fact, I once read that if a CEO can write the strategy entirely on their own, then they are either a genius or it is not really a strategy. I cannot remember who said that, not because the CEO is incapable, but because they are constrained. They are constrained by their perspective, by the environment they
Work in and by their own experience.
They're limited by their own experience, yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, this episode kicks off a series of episodes dedicated to strategy development and implementation.
We will discuss different methodologies, different approaches, their advantages and disadvantages, how to apply them and when, so stay with us.
In my view, this is almost a unique case where the strategic planning process is just as important as the outcome. It is the process in which we test hypotheses, think about the future, and gather expertise from both outside and inside the organization. In my opinion, that process is just as important as the strategy we ultimately formulate because it can change as the environment changes. But the process of thinking strategically itself is, in my view, of tremendous importance.
Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us in this episode. See you on the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel.